Achtung. Welcome to We Have Ways of Making You Talk with me, Al Murray, and of course with James Holland. There's an SMLE behind you, James. What else is that?
That's K98.
Yeah. Right, okay.
I found it in the corner and I forgot I had it.
Compare and contrast. Well,
yeah.
So appropriately enough, who are we talking to?
Well, we're talking
got
to
your rifles out.
We're talking to Doctor, or are you Professor? Dr. Matthew Ford from the University of Sussex. He's a former West Point fellow. He's got his PhD from the Department of War Studies at King's College, and we're very into what Matthew's doing because he is number crunching on statistics about small arms, not just in the Second World War, but beyond. But we're really, our focus is on Second World War and how that is, how these sort of thinkers about tactics, how they influence future tactics. I think it's all very, very interesting. So I'm really, really looking forward to this.
Welcome, Matthew. Thanks for joining us.
Great to be here. Thank you for having me, really. It's great. I can see you guys very active, always, and the number of times I get into little conversations with Al, or should I say Dr. Murray, and find myself on the wrong end of it. My favourite being when I said something along the lines of paratroopers, parachute vertical envelopment, who does that anymore? And that resulted in a long schooling by Al Murray as he kept putting out another tweet telling me that I was wrong.
Yeah, just don't diss airborne. Don't diss airborne.
Well, I don't know. I'm coming round to the idea that they're all a tragic waste of time.
I think it's fair to say I was.
Matthew, are you Matthew or are
I'm
you
Matthew.
Matt?
I tend to call myself Matthew, but I dare not think what others call me on Twitter. But I think on that particular moment I was owned.
I've followed you on Twitter for a long time and watched you talk about all sorts of stuff that at first glance, if you're if you're coming at the Second World War from sort of chaps and maps and battlefields and tales of daring do and and the adventure end of the conflict, or if you're coming at it from like, what motivates the Germans to fight, or the British to fight, or how does the operational level work, and all these because after all, the wonderful thing about the Second World War is its kaleidoscopic ability to deliver different things to look at, different pictures to every time you turn the tube, you get a different way of looking at it. But small arms is right at the heart of what we've been talking about, isn't it? The rifle that a rifleman carries and the section machine gun, these couldn't be more absolutely hot wired, especially if you're looking at the Second World War as the second great industrial war of all time. These are the things. That's the thing everyone should be talking about. Not the Battle of the Atlantic, but like the SMLE and so on.
I imagine. Well, you've got those guns behind you, James. I imagine those are that when you're making models and airfix kits and all the rest of it, you kind of start with things that obviously motivate, and you sort of go from there, really. And I think it's difficult now to kind of, when it comes to firearms, it's difficult to realise how much they've shaped thinking in Britain over a long period of time. Now that guns are no longer common in society, you forget, some of the people who've been writing about guns, certainly during the Second World War, they get into fourth editions. Some of these people, they're explaining guns and how they work and all the rest of it. They get into fourth editions, in the 50s and 60s after, some of them shot for the Olympics, British Olympic teams, all sorts of things. I'm interested in technology and the military more than just where you guys are in terms of the Second World War. And so I kind of did a longitudinal study, which I sort of ended up putting into my book, which I'm going to plug early, Weapon of Choice, now that I'm in front of you lot, right? So, which is a sort of longitudinal, I'm trying to understand how technology and change works within the British Army over a 100-year period. That was my PhD, 1880, which you can download for free, so you don't have to buy the book. And I might add that 6,000 people have already downloaded it. More for them. But anyway, it was trying to understand the relationship between officers and men, military change through the lens of the rifle, if you like. They're so well understood, and they're so simple. 120 components in maybe in an assault rifle, how could you make 100,000 words out of only 120 components? Well, I tell you, it's surprisingly easy when you start thinking about it, because engineers underwrite that relationship between soldier and officer. Because we can talk about the how to persuade soldiers to go forwards, how they are coerced into going into battle, and all the rest of it. But the social contract, if you like, between officer and man, is really underwritten by the engineer. In my estimation. Now, a lot of other military sociologists would disagree on all this bit. But once you start turning that around, you start to think, well, actually, if the weapon doesn't work, you're in all sorts of pain. And I can't think of an introduction of a military rifle over the last 100 years that hasn't been surrounded by some degree of controversy that results in something not working, politicians getting annoyed, industrialists getting it in the neck, engineers complaining, everyone blaming each other, reputations at stake, the whole 9 yards. In the warm-up, you were referencing the Sten. I mean, that's an obvious example. The early versions of the Sten, they weren't, how should we say, brilliant. But there's a reason why, that weapon continued in service right the way through into the 50s. And it's not just a function of the British Army not being able to figure out what weapon it wanted to bring into service to replace it with. It was also that, by the time we get to the later versions, it's not half as bad as it was. I'm going to go only as far as that. Not half as bad as it was in the earlier equivalents, right? So, I mean, I'm using guns really to try and understand the relationship between all these different people who are involved in using them, making them, trying to figure out what choices are the right ones, the optimal ones. You get all the way back to the logistics, supply chain, industrialists, all this kind of stuff. And that's a different story to one where a lot of military historians are, which is, as you say, on the daring do end of battle, where it's actually important, and there's lots of great stories about warriors and heroes and or cowardice and running away, which I think is, that's an important story. But I think that, well, I guess you guys, you have lots of people on your shows and stuff, and everyone's got a slightly different take on what's going on in battle. And I suppose that's the point. There's all these different interpretations, and someone somewhere has got to try and make sense of them so that they can come up with this bit of kit that James has got behind him. And so it might actually work, right?
So the SMLE, which I mean, James has an example behind him. When that was introduced, was there like because after all, I think the one in everyone's memory, the rifle that the British Army's had for the last nearly 4 decades now, isn't it? Which was a bullpup design, the LA80, isn't it?
SAA1.
And all the variants. Yeah, that's right. And all the variants of that weapon, which got an extremely bad press. It fell apart. You couldn't shoot straight with it. You couldn't. It was difficult to clean and reassemble and complex compared to the good old SLR, the old British Army, automatic musket and everything, which replaced the greatest infantry rifle of all time, the SMLE, as its reputation has become. But when it was introduced, was that surrounded in that kind of controversy?
Yeah. So the interesting thing is I did some work for the Army on why they wanted to know what I was doing some work helping them with SA80 replacement. From A2 to A3, and they wanted to know why they had the SA80 family of weapons in the first place, because they didn't know. This is so. I suppose that the key point there is that actually lessons learned and archival work and all this other stuff, that's considerably more challenge. When you hear someone in uniform saying, "Well, we got everything together. We got the after action reviews. We worked through it. We number crunched and we figured out what the best solution was on the back of that." Well, yes, and also possibly no. There's a bit of stuff in there around how the military need to present themselves. Underlying that are all these other challenges that are kind of masked and for all sorts of political reasons. The SA80 is absolutely one of those weapons that didn't work very well. And I think probably it's fair to say that the British Army really only got away with it because it wasn't used very much in action in Iraq. And so the lack of small unit engagements there meant effectively that, no one was challenged about, there were lots of reports about it not working, but, there were no British casualties. as a result of it misfiring or something falling off at the wrong time. And the result was that, and of course the Tory government, with all due respect, I'm a little bit of politics, the Tory government, having privatised Royal Ordnance Factories, the last thing they would necessarily want to do is reopen a story about a failed weapon. So they kind of just sort of forced the army to close it down and not really engage with that. And only when a Labour government came in, and I think that's kind of interesting as well. You sort of see these flip-flops across the last 100 years between Tory governments and Labour governments. You see that on the EM2, for example, on the decisions around designing a future weapon after the Second World War. There's a sort of, once a different government comes in, fresh air opens up into the discussion. And all of the problems that might have been there that were previously sort of buried or hidden or smudged out, or suddenly it becomes possible to engage with that as an issue again. And I think that's the point. When you think about small arms, they're so simple. You just don't think that there's all this reputation and
that it could be this complicated. Yeah, because after all, I mean, clearly the British Army prided itself. One of the tensions I think that is evident in the Second World War is between the professionals and the conscripts, isn't it? Those are your two bodies within the British Army, aren't they? And the professional army prided itself on accurate musketry, as it saw it. They still called it that, didn't they? The guys had to shoot really well, and then once the war progresses, well, it's about beating ground. It's about getting the other side to get their head down, rather than being able to shoot a guy through the eye at a mile.
Yes.
Quite clearly that when the war comes, or certainly once the war unfolds, the first 18 months, that's the tension, isn't it? In small arms use development, do you hang on to the weapons? Because after all, obviously the big question of the Second World War that the Germans can never make their minds up about is, do you hang on to the gear you've got? Or do you divert your current industrial output to something new, which after all may not work, may have lots of teething problems, and also you could have made, another million of the thing works okay in the meantime. And that's the tension in the Second World War, isn't it? Between those two groups in the British Army.
And what happens with the German changeover from the MG34 to the 42 is that they don't have any choice in the matter, because they just can't afford to keep making the MG34s. So it forces them to switch over from this to this sort of stamped metal machine gun, from this one that's been kind of sort of, more finely engineered. An MG34 costs 3 times as much in terms of man hours and something like 20 times as much in terms of actual cost from a Bren gun. Maybe it's not quite as much as that, but I mean, it is really a very, very expensive piece of kit. So they're forced into, there's no choice in the matter. They have to make that transition from the MG34 to the MG42. But in contrast, the Bren gun is perfectly okay in 1939, and it's still perfectly okay in 1945. It's not great. It's got things that you might want to change if you've got all the time in the world, but it's doing the job.
So you guys are, you're pepper potting all the right spaces. Under what conditions? When engineers go out to the battlefield, they talk to soldiers, and they realise soldiers don't know much about their weapons, right? So you go, well, so which?
And they also know that they've always got envy for the enemy.
Yes, exactly. So and of course, that perspective shapes their understanding as to what works and what doesn't work. And much of that is a sort of, after sales pitch. Have you made a convincing enough story to tell about the reliability, the effectiveness, the accuracy of your weapon, especially for people, as you referred to, Al, you've got some people who might consider themselves to be experts in inverted commas, and those who've just been hauled off the street, and psychometric testing has demonstrated that they are the least qualified to be in infantry, given that actually you need brainy people to do the tanks and the radio operators and the artillery and all this other stuff that involves clever maths and being able to write and stuff. You then, through psychometric and testing, you end up putting everyone else somewhere else. Where do you put them? You put them in infantry. Well, is that necessarily the best place for them, given the complexities of the battlefield? Well, it's open. It's an open discussion, I think. I think what you find in terms of where engineers are on this, they go, well, why? And it's not just engineering. After several years of fighting, they go to North Africa and they go, well, do we know? Do our troops have a sense of how these weapons work? And they come away with it's not just soldiers, I might add. It's also battalion commanders. They come away feeling less than confident, I think it's fair to say, that they should trust the perspectives of those people who are using the weapons, because they don't really know how to make them get the best out of the weapons. I mean, there's lots of underlying reasons for that, right? Around, there's a great story someone told me when I've been writing these threads on Twitter because I'm bored with COVID. The result is I end up chatting to all sorts of great people. Some people were working in small arms experimentation. People who I used to work with. They'd say that ranges, when it switched from yards to meters, they just swapped the yard sign for the meter sign, right? So 100 yards was 100 meters. Okay, so how do you judge wind? How do you get to the point where you could hit a target out beyond 300 yards? And actually, that isn't, the statistics there are very, just doing map surveys, you can see that the average opportunity to shoot beyond 300 yards when prone is really rather limited. So do you need a weapon that can hit targets beyond? And that's just by doing a survey of the world. You can take the world, get some maps, draw some lines across it, work out, if you're lying down, can you see that far? And you find you can't.
In general, you can't.
Yeah. So if you just
and that's the principle behind the development of the Sturmgewehr, isn't it? The German assault gun, because it doesn't have the range of the K-19.
The problem.
Go on, Matthew. Go on.
If you can't trust the user, then you need someone to interpret the battlefield. You've got different interpretations of what's going on there, and you've got different interpretations of what solution might work, right? And if you present loads of statistical data about the map being, map data saying you can't shoot beyond 300 yards, encourage you to then change your entire supply chain. Well, in the British Army, no, because there's a lot of complexities around actually just moving industrial. We didn't have enough weapons. We weren't producing enough weapons. With ammunition supply challenging at times. We had to do all of this work, including bringing in machine guns and all this other that were being produced in the States. You had to integrate that into a training regime that would allow people to understand how to make use of their kit. And if you've got conscripts, the question for the officers is: do you trust the conscript to do what you've told them to do? This, do you trust them to do it, right? And you've got codification of military law behind you to get soldiers to do what they're told, but actually, you can have a technology that reinforces them doing what they're told, or you can have a technology that undermines it. And let's go to the SDG 44. I think the story about the Sturmgewehr is actually more complicated. I don't think it's adequately told, and I think my work on Anglo-American and NATO small arms tells me that if I can write a story that's complicated for those things, then you can certainly write an equally as complicated story for German small arms. My view on SDG, the Sturmgewehr, is it's not necessarily viewed in terms of as an assault rifle. It's more a case of how do we compensate for the fact that we've got any old Tom, Dick, or Harry into German uniform and us have any chance that they might actually hit something. Well, we'll give them an automatic weapon. That's not about, in inverted commas, assault rifle. I mean, you can propagandize the weapon as an assault rifle, but that becomes a sort of post, especially in the context of British and Americans wanting to adopt their own automatic weapons. It becomes a slogan, right? We are just doing what the Germans did it really well. We are just falling into line behind that. But actually, the design history for...
But I suppose, but my point about the range was one about the range, that when they were developing it, they kind of recognised that actually no one was hitting anything beyond 300 yards. So you don't need a weapon that's going to be accurate to 300 yards because no one's firing that range. So why bother?
Okay,
although the Sturmgewehr can hit at 300 yards, it can't hit with any kind of remote kind of...
So the question is who's done the work that links that data back to the developers who are designing it? Right, so exactly. Yeah, so kind of, you go, well, hold on a minute, so we're sort of assuming that there's a relationship between what's going on the battlefield and engineers who are going, we figured out how to solve this problem, but we've got to sort of track the loop, and that's my problem, we don't... So I take all your points, right, about these things. I mean, in some ways, I think to myself, German kit during the Second World War was about overindulging the user. That's why we have so many different bits of kit. They all look cool. They're all Gucci and all the rest of it. But the problem is that the industrial manufacturers are very happy. Yes, of course we can give you another widget here. That, by the way, the price has just gone up. I don't know whether it's a bit like a builder. Yeah.
There's an awful lot of teeth sucking going on.
I'm not sure. Well, maybe we could do this.
It'll cost you.
That's right. So it's a bit like getting a builder in. You ask the builder to give him a specification, then you change the specification while he's on the job, and he, understandably, the price goes up.
Never was that more the case than with. I mean, I know we're talking about small arms, but never was that the case. More the case with German aircraft. I mean, the Junkers 88 is an absolute case in point. Where they start off going, I tell you what, let's have a really long range medium bomber that can go faster than anything else, can fly over 300 miles an hour, and it can go further than anything else. How cool is that going to be? And everyone goes, yeah, great. So the good folk at Junkers sort of go off and design it, and then halfway through they sort of, the Luftwaffe General Staff come to them and say, actually, we've been thinking about this. We'd really like the Junkers 88 that you're developing to have dive bombing capabilities. Can you do that? And the people at Junkers sort of do. Well,
it costs you,
but it will cost you. And it won't just cost you financially. It'll cost you in terms of speed and range and a whole host of other things. But at the end of it, and in terms of time, they've got a very, very expensive medium bomber which can sort of half dive bomb, but is not really much faster than the ones they've already developed in the mid-1930s, and certainly haven't got any further range.
And that beautiful thing about that story, James, is that it illustrates my general point, which is that you think that technology is going to go... I mean, that's the thesis of my book. You think that technology of weapons is going to go from not very sophisticated to highly sophisticated in a kind of straight line, and it just doesn't. Yeah. It bounces around all over the place. Armed forces select all sorts of weird things. You go, well, why did you do that? And, the only way you can explain that is when you go right it down deep into it and you start tracing the arguments. And the great thing about rifles is that they are really, really simple. And because they're simple, you can trace the arguments much more simply than if you had an F-35 where they've got 400,000 lines of code and you're trying to figure out...
Or you're trying
to figure out, who's involved in the developing this thing. The supply chain is so extensive, you can't map who's involved and why, a particular widget has suddenly turned up on things that you didn't know about before.
So many weapons basically then are developed in reaction to stuff as much as anything else. So they're developed in reaction to the officers going, my men couldn't hit that thing 3 miles away that day. And someone goes, we better put range in then. And then someone's saying, well, they give off too much smoke. Well, we better make them smokeless. And then you know what I mean? And anyway, anecdote, because you earlier on you're saying about North Africa, they crunch the numbers, they look at the numbers, and then they find out that people don't really know how their weapon systems work. We all know if you present statistics to someone and they go, yeah, but the time I did it, it didn't do that, or the time I did it, they were further away than that. The statistics aren't worth the paper they're printed on. The statistics never survive an encounter with anecdote, do they? In general, and especially not in a thing like battle where people are going, my life was on the line and my rifle jammed. Don't tell me it only jams one time in 100 because it jammed on me that time. Sort it out. And I think that's what's going on, isn't it? And like you say, so the engineer's in the middle. He's also got a budget. That's the other thing, isn't he? The Allies famously go, well, we could make an expensive thing to do this, but we could make 10 times the amount for a lot less. So we'll do the cheap things. Sten guns are cheap, aren't they? Which is sort of their driving motive in their manufacture.
But that's a very good motive. And let me.
I'm not arguing with that.
No, I know. Yeah, but can I?
I was just going to say, it depends on how you think that you might win the battle, right? It seems to me that do you really want to? We know you guys know more than that manpower's a shortage. By time you go back to northwest Europe. You know that actually the level of expertise in the British Army is, there's lots of people who know stuff, but, you still cream off the top and you send them off into parachute regiment. You send them off to market garden and they fail. Sorry, with all due respect to anyone in maroon. Under those circumstances, you want to put your manpower... I mean, you have the infantry ideal. The infantry ideal is to close with the enemy, right? But that is, I think there's a reason why I'm calling it an ideal, and that's because it's not. We should be careful about whether that actually happens or not.
Well, I mean, you're getting me thinking about something, and following the fall of Tobruk on the 21st of June 1942, there was absolute outcry back home. How could this have happened with all the arms, all the stuff that we've been sending over to North Africa? How can we have let this happen? And amongst the ranks who were fighting in 8th Army, there were a number of MPs, there were a number of people who knew MPs, and they all fired off missives going, it's outrageous, the weaponry we've got is appalling, it's absolutely terrible. Why is it that the Germans have this 88mm gun and we don't have anything approximately like that? And so the government gets taken to task, and Oliver Littleton, who is the Minister for Production at the time, Supply Production, I can't remember, anyway, he's the man in charge. He stands up and goes, well, we've got a perfectly good, we've got the equivalent of the 88mm gun that the Germans are using. It's called a 3.7 inch. And we've got about 100 more than the Germans have in Africa. If you commanders out in Africa aren't using them, that's not my fault. What are they doing? And what they are doing is they're defending Cairo with anti-aircraft guns where there's no Luftwaffe going over them. So everyone sort of goes, sort of, shaking their jowls. But he points out very, very cogently that they've got a weapon that's every bit as good. So then they start sort of going, oh yeah, well, yeah. But the problem is that that's a 3.7 inch anti-aircraft gun, and our gunners aren't trained how to use it. Well, all you got to do is open the breech, put a gun in, and put a shell in, point and fire. That's the whole point. It's not, you're not having to kind of work out, gun laying radar or anything. And also, we've got the heavy goods transports to transport it. I mean, Jesus, if the Africa Corps has, and we certainly have as the British. I mean, so in other words, quite often people think they haven't got the weaponry, and they actually have because they're not using it in the way they should.
My Marshall thread on Twitter was the one that caught your eye. I mean, that's where Marshall is.
So Stan Marshall, we were talking about the other
General
day.
Stan Marshall, he's this American journalist, disputed experience in the First World War, then was a newspaper man, and then found himself
in some disputed rank.
Yeah, exactly right. So he then found himself back in the Pacific in 1943, doing after-action reviews with people coming off the firing line and trying to get a sense as to what was going on in battle, really. And it seems to me that was a sort of test of how strong that relationship was between officer and man, and and he has got, I don't know whether you read any of his stuff, but his writing style is so authoritative, and it's very convincing stuff, and I love it really, I really do. And in terms of and I understand why there's lots of dispute, because armed forces, the first thing they want to do is say that they weren't as bad as all that. We've done all right, and slam, and so there's a bit of dispute about that. And at the same time, going back to the conscripts point that Al was making, we've got compared to non-wartime experiences, we've suddenly got a lot of people with wartime experience. And that then becomes a part of society more broadly, because then people are trying to make sense of what was going on. And I think Marshall, as a journalist, he could communicate, right? He could set that out for people. And that's what, for me, that's why he's important. He's important because he's sort of trying to understand how soldiers participate in battle. It's that nature of what we're doing, that participation frames all sorts of things. It frames military sociology coming out of the Second World War. It frames, after the war, what are people interested in? Why did the Germans keep going, right? And why did the Allies keep going forwards, right? So military sociologists are trying to work that out, right? But from a tactical, technical point of view, the bit that I was interested in, and that is not properly or adequately covered in my mind from a military sociology point of view or from a military history point of view, is what technologies can help push the armies going forwards, or try and create the circumstances in which they are delayed. And that comes down to, weight, whether the weapon encourages you to shoot, whether you've got enough ammunition in the supply chain so you just keep going, whether there's the logistics infrastructure behind you to ensure that the ammunition's at the front line to keep you going forwards. Marshall, in his writing about weapons, the reason why he's so important, I think, is he sets up that discussion in a way that, and popularizes that discussion in a way that I think, what do you say to engineers? They don't go out in front, with all due respect, now I'm going to insult engineers now. With all due respect to engineers, you don't, it's a bit like analysts. You don't put them in front of the public, not like you guys, you put them in front of the public. You look good, you say, like, sort of make things simple, you make everything, and it's important stuff, right? But engineers, you don't put in front of the public. If you put them in front of the public, they'll just confuse everyone with technical statistics and clever stuff. And, what does the public want? They want some anecdote. It doesn't work like this. We want some warrior coming along and solving the problem. The engineer's going, no, it's not about warriors. It's about volume of fire. And Marshall sort of helps you get a grip on that, really. And that's why I think he's really important. He sloganizes something that makes it possible to think about introducing assault rifles to use. I think that's a phrase that probably, at the time they wouldn't have described it necessarily as an assault rifle. A machine carbine, maybe, is a euphemism for a Sten gun, right? It's sort of trying to militarize rather than popular, and also, it's about saying something about the different martial cultures of the British Army, the American Army, and the German Army. And that's why, a little bit of me goes, well, Sturmgewehr 44, there's a sense in which it makes sense. You go, we need a weapon that can combine range and automatic firepower. So obviously, it's inevitable that we'll have a Sturmgewehr 44, and it's just the Allies catching up with that. And actually, that story isn't quite clear cut. There's a lot of different attitudes towards weaponry, even between the British and the Americans, different cultures, different approaches, different thinking. And as you said right at the get-go, even, if you've got a mass army, they have different needs to a professional army. If you've got a mass army, the question is, for an engineer, how do you design a weapon that takes away the challenges of learning to use your weapon optimally? Because we can design that into the weapon itself. And suddenly you don't have to train the conscript in how to use their weapon, because the engineers have solved the problem in the first place, right? And that is quite an important insight, I think. And I think it was kind of made possible by Marsh. He licensed it, if you like.
We're going to take a quick break now. We're talking to Dr. Matthew Ford. Welcome back to Weird Ways of Making You Talk. We're talking to Matthew Ford about weapons, technology, and the rest. The ammo clip on the Garand, for instance, is such a brilliant idea, isn't it? Because if the soldier's loaded that correctly, he just has to put it in his rifle and the rifle will shoot for him, essentially. And it's also why you hang on to bolt-action rifles for so long. Automatic weapons have made their point in the First World War, quite emphatically, haven't they? But in the Second World War, both sides entered the war with a bolt-action rifle. Because, and you can also see why the AK-47 then part of this lineage. It's a mass army. You've got 6 weeks with a guy maybe before you put him into battle. You haven't got time to turn him into a marksman. Whereas a regular army where a guy's in for 4, 5 or 12 years and goes to butts regularly and gets to know his weapon really well, you can, if you want, give him a more sophisticated piece of kit.
Yeah, I think that's, you've hit the nail on the head. At what point, where in design terms, are you designing for a marksman? Are you designing for someone who's got lots of professional experience? Are you designing for someone who's at the butts on a regular basis so that you can practice? What do you know about any army? You know that they never have time for practice. And what do you know about any treasury? They're not going to pay for it, right? So, it's under those circumstances, why you can't be sure that the people you're putting into the front line are going to know how to use their weapon, and their weapon-mindedness may or may not be there, right? from an engineering point of view, the question is how far forwards do you push the design so that you can relieve the training and doctrine and command hierarchy from having to directly oversee the soldier to make sure that they're doing what they're doing. Because the rifle or the small arm really effectively provides the soldier with the means for survival and the means by which the commander can carry out his intent. That's the importance of the weapon, right? It's not, on the one, if you want to survive, shoot. If you want to live, you've got to, so that carries you forwards, right? Gives you the opportunity psychologically, and again, Marshall plugs into that. Psychologically, it gives you a sense of you are doing something to control your own destiny in a context that is completely mad, and is beyond your capacity in any other meaningful sense to in any meaningful way to make sense of. So, the rifle as a technological artifact gives you the means for controlling your environment, right? And that's kind of very, very, you wouldn't get that. If I was a classic military historian and I said that, you'd look at me and go, what? Right? I think that's why, I'm kind of, why when you broaden the discussion a little bit and you bring in the perspectives of soldiers, engineers, scientists, industrialists, bureaucrats, alliance partners, you put it all together, you get suddenly the meaning of these things and how they work in these different contexts, how these rifles get adopted, suddenly becomes, much more, you start to see the interconnections and the relationship between armed forces and society. And actually, you start to get a sense of martial culture that you don't get if you just talk about warriors all the time.
So why is it that the Germans end up with these incredibly rapid-firing machine guns and no one else does?
Well, why don't you ask a Germanist?
I mean, the MG34 begins life as a dual-purpose gun, weapon, which is also as a light anti-aircraft weapon as well. And so presumably you need rapid rate of fire if you're going to have any hope at all of trying to shoot down an aircraft flying over you.
So, but you see, I think that okay. So the reason, the thing is when it comes to small arms, everyone has a view. Right, that's the problem. Right, everyone has a view of battle, but on guns, it's surprisingly everyone has a point of view. So my approach was to go back to the archive and actually try and see what people were saying about these things so that I could at least go, well, yeah, I understand why you're arguing that, but it's not really what people were saying at the time, right? So. And the problem, my strong view is that on the story of the MG34 and the MG42, despite the fact that everyone knows, my strong feeling is that we don't really know. Why is it that you pick a cyclic rate of 600 rounds per minute? Why is it that you have a drum magazine and a belt magazine? Why is it that on the one hand, obviously a universal machine gun gives you the opportunity to say, well, we can hide behind, we're under certain strict conditions as a result of the Versailles Agreement, so therefore, we need to universalise the machine gun. All the rest of it. But if you think about it, a machine gun in a tank, a machine gun for light infantry, a machine gun for armoured vehicles, a machine gun for anti-aircraft role, a machine gun for fixed positions, engineers have got lots and lots of stuff to deal with to try. They can't bend physics, so they've got to figure out how to put all of these requirements into one gun. It seems to me that it's not obvious that the solution that was arrived at was in some way inevitable. There was a lot of stuff going on in the background. I'm certainly not disputing that there are some good arguments to be had about this thing. In fact, they're highly entertaining, and if you get on Twitter, you'll see them blast past you as you and they come this way, and then someone, I prompted it.
No, it's literally the old chestnut on Twitter.
Bren versus
Second World War weapon feeds.
Bren versus MG42. Yeah,
but it is very odd that maybe it's just that when they designed it, that's how it came out. Literally just as simple as that. It might well be. I don't know. But the Maxim gun is firing at 500 rounds a minute, let's say, or 600 or whatever it is, 500, 600, and seems to do an incredibly effective job in the First World War. And they're still using MG08s in the Second World War as well. And yet, in 1934, they developed this brand new, super duper, very expensive, highly engineered light machine gun that can fire at 900 rounds a minute. And then, because that gets a little bit too expensive and uses up too much metal and too many man hours, they then develop the MG42, which then operates at 1400 rounds a minute. And, that's a really hell of a pace.
So from a design point of view, what you clearly, you've got fleeting targets, and you need to hit those. You need to be able to hit those targets at a certain range, and you know that you can't see out to a certain, beyond 300 yards. We've already set that, and we've also, studies, at least on the British side, 80-90% couldn't hit targets beyond, say, 200, 300 yards, just on looking at actions. And so, the weapons that you've got are effectively over-engineered for the problem that you've got, right? So if you're over-engineering, how effective is that, right? Well, firstly, you're locking up a whole heap of supply chain, logistics, infrastructure, and industrial capacity in producing something that is too much for the battlefield problem that you're facing. But on top of that, studies after the war, and I'm quoting this because when you were saying that, studies after the war, American studies, Operational Research Office said current models of fully automatic hand weapons afford neither. They're not adequate. They don't provide to improve the effectiveness that the range is not covered. The adoption of pattern dispersion principle in the hand weapons could partly compensate for human aiming errors and thereby significantly increase the hits at ranges up to 300 yards. Currently, models of fully automatic hand weapons afford neither these desirable characteristics nor are they adequate alternatives. So, automatic weapons after the war, as they were being designed, couldn't actually satisfy the problem set that the ORA were coming up with. So that's the thing, right? You go, the irony here is we'll have automatic weapons, and the studies were saying, well, you give an automatic weapon to a marksman and an expert, and they still don't sodding hit anything. Right? So at that point, the engineers go, well, how far? So why is it that we adopt those things, right? There's a I'll give you the short version, unless you've got lots of time. The short version is really that you have to transfer your cultural identity, your identity markers, to a different weapon. The M1 is a very powerful marker in American culture. It's what is Patton? I can't remember what Patton said now about the M1, but it's like the ideal.
No, the weapon that won the Second World War. He says it's the greatest fighting implement.
So if you're going to come up with
a
plastic gun, right, the M16, after you've had Patton over your shoulder saying, this is an awesome piece of kit, and he's if he hadn't died, he'd be like going, you what? You want to replace this proper piece of kit, this proper engineered, properly designed, makes it possible for us to shoot things out to 2,000 yards with a plastic gun, right? That's quite a lot of effort you have to get to come up with new myths, allow you to transfer your martial allegiance from this cultural icon, dominates people's perspectives about how weapons work, to this new thing that, people would describe as a Mattel weapon, right? And so, there's a lot of, it's an anthropologist's it's an anthropologist's field day to try and explain the signifiers and the challenges associated with moving people from one end, cultural markers from this place to this place, right? But the really ironic thing is that the thing in there is that you even when you adopt the Mattel weapon, it still doesn't help you, right? According to the analysis. You've got a weapon that is automatic, but it doesn't actually hit targets when you're either a marksman or a expert. So you go, well, why is that? So why the principle that they're pushing for is a salvo weapon after the war, right? You can press the trigger, several rounds come over. It's a dispersion pattern. Basically, you're giving yourself a greater probability There's a greater probability that you'll hit the target.
So you're loading the dice of lethality.
Exactly so, right? Exactly so. It's almost like you've been preparing. I'm sorry. Stop with the teasing. I'm only getting you back because I was. One day I went to one of your gigs. Not this again. I was playing the Malvinas. What do the Argentinians call the Falkland Islands? And I pressed the buzzer, and you had your foot on the button, and it said, and he went, "No, you don't think you get to choose, do you? I'm choosing, right?" And I was, and I said the Malvinas, and that it was a good game of fact hunt, and it's nice when 1,000 people shout out at you that you're playing fact hunt.
Oh my God, I had no idea. I had no idea we had that kind of history, Matthew. I'm so sorry. That's not me.
No,
anyway.
that's another
him.
person. But I had the thin T-shirt.
It's the pub landlord.
I had the thin T-shirt rather than the fat one, right? And you're struggling into it, and you're going, hold on, I'm an academic, or I wasn't at the time, but I'm fat. Of course I'm fat. I'm an academic. Anyway, so but you... you don't...
You've taken 50 minutes to tell me that, you bastard.
It was only a matter of time. It's revenge is sweet. You know, when you're trying to do serious things and I'm now getting you back for the other side. You thought the heckles only came from you to me. But no.
You usually only go one direction.
You're on my turf now.
Brilliant.
Anyway, so it's the astonishing thing is you can't even hit the bloody targets with these things. We'll just go back to guns now.
Yeah.
You know, so why is it that you adopt that stuff? Well, I think it's because the infantry have status anxiety, right? And I think that's probably the challenge around marksmanship more broadly. You know, it's how do you set up your set yourself up as a professional at arms when the artillery and tanks and air force and all these other things are all actually winning the battle. If they're winning the battle, then hold on a minute, what about us?
Well, it's poor bloody infantry, isn't
it? Marshall resuscitates their place, you know. I think he gives them voice. That's why that's another reason why he's so important. And another reason why I enjoy stuff, and another reason why I've really enjoyed the arguments we've been having on Twitter about whether, you know, Marshall was important, significant, or whatever. And of course, the good colleagues Robert Engen in Canada, you know, he's putting me in my place, and sensibly so. But you know, and I got a note from another mate, Tom Brasino at Carlisle at the Army War College, going, no, hold on a minute, he's asking the right question, but he's asking the wrong question, but giving the right answer. So you get the one thing about Twitter is at least you get a good debate going on. Or you get shouted at. I don't know. Yeah. or you get owned by Al Murray, which is always
no, not at all. This is absolutely fascinating stuff, Matthew, because to be honest, these conversations happen a lot around armour design and you know, tank design. People talk about it in these terms an awful lot. You know, Soviet tanks being simple, American tanks being products of mass production. You know, after all, the British suffer that big crisis of confidence in their gear tank equipment in the desert in 41, 42. But then maybe they're just bad at using them, and maybe the tanks are actually fine after all, and reliability isn't really the issue. It's that they don't know what they're doing with them yet. They haven't worked it out. And it's very interesting that this conversation goes around all the sort of posh end, but again, what the infantry, the bread and butter weapons that the infantry have to use, kind of get pushed aside in these arguments. And that, you know, modern perspectives are sort of the tail wagging the dog in how we interpret what's going on in the Second World War. You know, like you say, it's about martial confidence, isn't it? If the other side have got an automatic weapon, if the other side have an assault rifle, Kong can afford an assault rifle, why wouldn't you have an assault rifle yourselves? And with a natty smaller round that's easier to carry and all that sort of stuff, you know, all the stuff that goes with that changing caliber as well. I mean, it's absolutely fascinating.
Well, yeah, and it's also that relationship, isn't it, between perception and hard data. I mean, you know, there is a perception that the Sherman tank is liable to burst up in flames, which is why it's known as a Ronson. And you know, statistically, Sherman is no more likely to catch fire than any other tank. I mean, you know, it really isn't, and you can't argue. So
I think small arms are subject to a lot of myth because no one really. You know, despite everyone knowing what's going on in battle, there's also no concern. It's a sort of knowledge resource. Everyone's got an opinion, which the number one thing. The other is that, so that fuels these kinds of anecdotal responses. The other thing is that obviously engineers coming out with their statistical analysis of things is not going to convince anyone of anything. Right, we've worked out what your problem is, and it's here's the numbers, and everyone goes, what does that mean?
Well, you should try being in a bloody battle.
There you go. Right. So, but the great thing, the really smart engineers know that they need to create a myth about their own weapon, so that it can then create the conditions under which it might get accepted. So one of the smart moves from Eugene Stoner, the designer of the M16, was that, you know, effectively what you have to do is create a myth around the 5.56 round. So that you can convince everyone that its lack of stability produces, you know, massive wounding, right? And that massive wounding then convinces you that when you're on the way in battle in Vietnam, or whatever, you know, that you want to use obviously this is war, right? So you're you don't want to, but you're building confidence in your equipment because it's got this this capacity that you wouldn't otherwise have heard about. And Stoner was really good pitching that story so that soldiers would start to get a sense as to why this was the switch over from the M14, as it was, the M1, M14, M16. Why that was a good move.
But you know what? This leads me directly to ask about the myth and legend surrounding the Bren gun. The reason in the end it was phased out is because too accurate. you hear that a lot. Army lore. The Bren gun was too accurate. That was the problem with it. It was just, which is why it needed to be replaced with something belt fed. And sometimes that you even hear stories that the sights would be buggered with because the weapon was just too accurate. Whereas obviously what that is that's not true. What does too accurate mean?
The Army, when they asked me way back, to look at SA-80 replacement, they didn't know why they had the family of weapons that they did, right? So when someone says, well, we've got this story about the Bren gun, I'm inclined to go, you have. That's very interesting. And you listen politely and you go, that's very and you note it down. And then you go, well, okay. So, I mean, the story of the GPMG and the Bren, the Bren, the arguments around the use of the LMG after the war are complicated. And the reason they're complicated is because the British Army adopts what's called the EM2, which is the experimental model number 2, which is, for want of a better phrase here, an assault rifle, a bullpup assault rifle, a precursor to the SA-80. And the goal is to replace a number of weapons, the number 4, the Sten, and all in one weapon, right? And to complement that with some kind of general purpose machine gun. When you've got the good old SLR, because, you can't come to... The Americans outfox the Brits, really, when it comes to selecting, at one point in 51, I can't remember. 51, the British Army does select the number 9 rifle. There's a big fight between Field Marshal Slim and Churchill at number 10. Lord Cherwell's taking notes. This is one of those times where prime ministers actually give a toss about guns, which is astonishing, really. But then Churchill kicked off some of that story around selecting a new weapon after the war because he wanted to standardise with American weaponry. Slim, Field Marshal Slim is being told by his engineers that the best piece of kit is the EM2. And so he says, well, we need the best piece of kit. And the result is you have a big ding-dong with Churchill at number 10. Lord Cherwell is taking the notes, and you should read the notes. They're quite kind of entertaining. So you say this one, and they have different... it's bad when they have different minutes. Right? And of course, Churchill figures out how to delay Slim and figures out how to and you can use time to delay the process by which a decision then translates into implementation. And, suddenly the problem becomes more complicated. If you want to fudge the decision, then ask the Canadians and the French and the Belgians and all the other people to come, all the other emerging NATO powers to come in, get involved. And then, the Americans will cut a deal with the French and the French will go, yes, no, the EM2 is rubbish and, we need a different caliber. Suddenly you end up with the self-loading rifle, which is a great Belgian design, from Fabrique Nationale. And that weapon, you could fire it on automatic, and it was designed to do that. But when you're putting a 7.62 round through it, which is an American, which is the standard that the Americans settled on, you hurt your shoulder and you don't hit anything, right? And so. It doesn't. So you move it to self-loading function, equivalent to one shot automatic fire, but one shot, and you have to keep pulling the trigger. No need to. It's not a bolt action, and you have to then have some kind of something to replace the Sten gun, and that's where you get the Sterling, and then you get the Sterling, the SLR, and then you go, well, what do we need here when it comes to LMG? What is that role? What's that how are we gonna have a weapon there? Because we're busy building the GPMG as well, right? And the GPMG, I don't know if you pick one up, but I wouldn't exactly describe it as light.
Yes.
So you find that the Bren suddenly retains a role in the British Army in a sort of light infantry capacity when we're off trying to pretend that we're withdrawing from Empire in a sensible and orderly and non-coercive manner, when that's just not true. And, there's lots of nastiness going on, and the LMG still has a role under those circumstances. But whether it has a role, on the plains of in a NATO in a European context, there's a reason why the MG3 is there, which is the MG42 in 762, right? And you can put it on a vehicle. You can organise yourself around the vehicle, and then you don't have to carry it. It's quite sensible, really. Well, because the point is that I'm interested in how technology changed over a 100-year period, right? And, I'm looking at warfare now in the 21st century, and instead of the weapon of choice being the rifle, I'm kind of getting to the point where we're thinking about the phone as something really instrumental in shaping how we think about the battlefield, right? Because we're talking about how to deliver ordnance onto the battlefield. What are people? They're looking at this thing, right? As a way of framing how you imagine getting ordnance onto the battlefield. And by the way, radicalwar.com is the website for the book. The phone offers a different way of participating in war, in a way that, 100 years ago, the rifle, 100 years ago, after the Boer War, Lord Roberts is going, well, people don't know how to shoot, so we're going to have boys' clubs for shooting. And now we've got the ubiquitous smartphone has sort of become this thing that sits in the background and frames how we think about war now. I'm going to send you a copy and you can go, no, it's rubbish.
No, that's a fascinating notion. Well, thank you so much, Matthew. I mean, it is the sociological aspects of technology, especially technology in war, where, after all, as you said earlier, it's an insane situation you're in, and these are pieces of technology designed to deal with essentially moments of madness. Obviously, lots of thought and lots of ideas, and then lots of countercurrents go into them. So, I mean, I feel truly enlightened about a lot of this. And Weapon of Choice by Dr. Matthew Ford, ladies and gentlemen, in all good bookshops and W.H. Smith's. Oh, brilliant. Thanks for talking to us, Matthew. Thanks, everyone, for listening. We'll see you all again soon. Cheerio.
Cheerio.
Bye-bye.